What's up, everybody? Welcome to the second episode of Greatness Begins, our podcast all about my favorite games on the PlayStation 1. Of course, I am your host, Ryan Turford, the man on the moose. And today, we've got a pretty cool episode ahead of us. But before we get into all that, of course, this podcast is, of course, exclusive to the PlayStation Drive podcast feed, as well as patreon.com/carpoolgaming, and then youtube.com/carpoolgaming. So, of course, like the video, subscribe to our channel, let us know in the comments below what you think about today's game. And, of course, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you're listening on podcast feeds. And also, if you want this show a little bit early, or if you want some other goodies, head over to patreon.com/carpoolgaming. So today's game I'm pretty excited to talk about because everyone kind of knows me. They know that I love horror games. Now, this one's not like a traditional horror game. It is, but it isn't. There's actually you actually play this game a long time before you get to like any of the horror elements throughout the game. But it's a game that I actually really was excited to play for the first time, when it came out. Because I remember seeing commercials for it and seeing it in magazines and being actually, pretty excited to check this one out. And today's game, friends, as you probably, gleaned from the episode title, is Fear Effect on the PlayStation 1. This was released in North America on February 24th, 2000, and it was developed by Kronos Digital Entertainment and published by Eidos. So this was actually one of, if I'm remembering correctly, one of like the last in kind of the slate of Eidos titles before, the Square Enix purchase of Eidos that happened kind of in the early 2000s. And definitely there were some Eidos published games on the PlayStation 2, stuff like Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness, and Legacy of Kain Defiance and things like that. But definitely like, Eidos was kind of the house of Tomb Raider and Deus Ex and Legacy of Kain and a whole bunch of different franchises. And of course, this is all coming up now because recently we had the news that, Eidos, as well as like the studios associated with it, and then all the IPs were essentially sold off to Embracer Group. So this game, including today's game, which is Fear Effect, of course, Fear Effect actually kind of belongs in the Embracer Group kind of formula. So that's actually pretty cool to know. Again, this was, again, pre-Square Enix, an Eidos game from Kronos Digital Entertainment, which is actually a very small studio that very quickly was kind of dissolved because essentially they made a couple games before Fear Effect came out. They made some like smaller offshoot stuff. They also helped, contribute stuff to the Spider-Man cartoon series apparently as well. I'm not sure too much about their development there, but they also created the Fear Effect series, which had an additional sequel. They were also working on a third game that unfortunately never saw the light of day because the team kind of ran out of money during development because Eidos just wasn't really able to put more money into development, because when that game was being worked on, it was just one of those things where the company was running out of money at that point. So they had to shift their budgets around. And unfortunately, they weren't able to, fully fund the project. And unfortunately, after that, Kronos kind of closed down. So Fear Effect 2 Retro Helix was actually their last game, essentially. So, which is too bad, because I actually think that Fear Effect is actually a pretty fun game. And for those that might be wondering, why include a game like Fear Effect on here? Number one, I think this game's actually really fun. From the modern sense, there are obviously some troubling things about it, and we'll definitely get to that in a little bit later in this episode. But I definitely think, for what it's worth, this game is really impressive. It also looks really good today as well. But again, we'll talk about that more as we go into this. And I think part of the looks really kind of blends into the historical significance of this game and why I was so interested in this game to begin with. So as you can kind of tell from the cover art here anyways, you basically have three main characters, but the style itself, the visual style of the game, kind of looks like this like anime style game. And of course, this was around the time when I was like really getting into anime and was wanting to just eat up, everything anime related. And while I wouldn't really consider this an anime game or anything like that, what stuck out to me anyways was, looking at this game in magazines or, seeing, a commercial of it on TV. It was the visual style of the game, because this was one of the very first modern examples of cell shading in video games. It's not the first. I mean, Mega Man Legends came out in 1997, and from my research, I think that's the first cell shaded game, or at least the first major cell shaded game. Again, if you have any more info about that, please, feel free to correct me in the comments below. But Fear Effect was actually a really important game because it was the first game that I remember seeing that had cell shaded graphics. And I thought the graphics really popped at the time that it came out. I thought that this was a very gorgeous looking game and one I was really excited to play, just by, again, seeing, stuff in magazines about it or seeing commercials about it. Now, I will say, along with that, there is some controversy with this game, and it's not even with the game itself, because the game itself is not, portrayed in this way. But it was more of a controversy with the marketing for this game at the time, because essentially they were kind of like trying to play up the sexiness of, the main character, or at least one of the main characters anyways, Hana. She's the main female character on the box art. And basically they're trying to play up that, she's the sexy character and you should play the game because, she's you want to see her, I guess. But ultimately, there's three main characters, and the story is not even just about Hana. And again, it's not even sexualized in the game itself. It's just the marketing, for some reason, the marketing team felt like they needed to push the game in that direction. And this was actually common with IDOS titles at the time, because we also saw something similar happen with Tomb Raider, which again, Lara Croft, sure, she's a pretty nice looking character, but at the same time, like, in the games themselves, it wasn't trying to, exude that in the way that the marketing for the game did. And I felt the same, Fear Effect had kind of the same problem, which I think actually, looking back on it now, probably just, made it so that some people wouldn't check this game out because of it. But I can assure you, it's definitely nothing like that. And it's definitely, it's got its own charms to it. So what's this game about? What's Fear Effect, and what are you doing in this game? Because of course, you're hearing me talk about how this is a horror game, but on the cover here, it's just three people, shooting it up. I mean, it doesn't look like there's any horror elements to this game. Well, this game actually kind of, blends kind of Asian horror with Asian mafia stuff essentially together, and kind of like has this like weird hodgepodge of a story together. So basically, in the far distant future, this takes place like beyond like 2050. Essentially, there's flying cars, and it's very all like Blade Runner-esque essentially when you're moving around the city and when they're showing the city. Basically, in the game itself, the daughter of a Hong Kong triad boss disappears, and three mercenaries, Hana, Glass, and Deke, try and kidnap her before the triad find her. So essentially, in the first mission of the game, you're basically, hunting down triad members. You're trying to get information on, where this girl has, decided to run off to, because they basically want to kidnap her so they can hold her for ransom, essentially, against this, mob boss, essentially. So you don't exactly feel like you're the good guys in this game. But eventually, the game takes a spooky turn to it, and you're dealing with all kinds of crazy horror elements. And I really like that aspect of the game. Again, it's not a survival horror game. There is, and like not, infinite amount of ammunition in this game, but I always found that I never was like running low on ammunition or anything like that. In the same way that I did with something like Resident Evil or, other survival horror games. So I do like that the element of horror that's added to the story. And I think it's actually like, it's got a really strong script to it. It's got some great dialogue. It's got some like really unique and cool characters that are in it as well. And I just really like the story in Fear Effect. I think it's actually really well written, and I think it's a lot of fun to actually go through. Now, you might have also noticed, by me holding the case, this has got 4 discs in it. Well, it's not that the story is super long. In fact, the game itself, you can beat it in like maybe 8 to 10 hours or so. It's not too long of a game. But the reason it's 4 discs is because of the way the visuals are designed in the game, which is, again, goes back to something that I thought was pretty impressive. So essentially the visual design, as you're probably seeing in the B-roll here, is essentially it's got cel-shaded character models, but it's also got those cel-shaded character models are layered on top of FMV cutscenes, essentially, that are playing looped in the environment itself. So rather than using static backgrounds like a lot of PS1 games did at the time, this actually uses full motion video with character models layered on top of it to look like you're basically running around it, which is just, it's cool to look at, actually. It's a visually striking game, and I definitely remember it being visually striking the first time I played it and popped in my PlayStation 1 on a CRT TV, and just having a blast with playing through this cool story with these great visuals. And again, I also really like the design of the locations that you go to and visit in the game. I also like the enemy design in this game. I think all that stuff is really, really well done. And again, I think it just holds up over time. I think it actually stands the test of time quite well. The downside is, though, and why this isn't higher on my list, actually, is some of the gameplay can be a little bit difficult, especially combat in particular, because this game actually uses tank controls, similar to something like Resident Evil to control. So you're essentially, you press forward to move in whatever direction your character is facing in, but then you have to like press left or right on the D-pad to kind of like pick your direction and go. Now, this game also supports the DualShock, analog sticks, which does make this control much smoother. But I found whenever I play this game that like the analog control is basically shut off like every minute or so for whatever reason. And it basically, you have to keep enabling it. And at that point, you may as well just play with the D-pad at that point because it's not very fun. So, while I don't mind that type of exploration style, just when you're exploring things, it does make combat much more difficult than it needs to be. And it definitely leads to some hair-pulling moments for sure, which, of course, that's where all my hair went from last week's show. It's just, I pulled out all my hair playing Fear Effect, for the capture for this particular episode because of the difficulty. So, again, this game has some serious difficulty spikes, and then the difficulty spikes are just made worse because of the clunky controls. But at the same time, if you can get your head around that, honestly, I think that Fear Effect's a great time. I really enjoyed my time with this game, both revisiting it for the purposes of this list, but also I remember just enjoying it when it came out as well. I think this is actually a really solid PlayStation 1 game, and I think it's got a really solid sequel, but maybe I'll leave that one for another day, folks. Wink, wink. But enough about Fear Effect. What do you think about Fear Effect? I also want to point out as well, I forgot to mention this on last week's show, because on our old list with the Roundabout and the Crossroads, I would usually always mention towards the end of the episode, where you can find this game now or where you can kind of play this game. So Fear Effect had a sequel in development at Square Enix, or not a sequel, a remake in development at Square Enix, because they also did kind of like a top-down shooting game called Fear Effect Sednuna that came out on Xbox One, so you can play it there, or PS4. And they were actually also developing a full remake of Fear Effect 1. That was supposed to come out later, and we had no idea when. Now that the sale of the Embracers happened, and we haven't heard anything about that remake since the announcement, I'm thinking it's probably dead. And that's too bad, because the only way to play this game is on a PlayStation 1. Unless, of course, if it comes to the PlayStation Plus service, hopefully next month, because we're still kind of a month away before that service launches here in North America. Hopefully we get a game like Fear Effect on there, because I think it's a really solid game, a really solid pickup, and it's not too expensive as well if you want to jump into it yourself and play it on PlayStation 1. I think it's a solid game. I think it's a solid pickup, and if you like horror games, if you like, Hong Kong kind of like mafia movies involving the triad, I think you're going to really enjoy this game. So definitely check out Fear Effect. I think it's worth picking up. But yeah, you will have to play it on a PlayStation 1. And unfortunately, and you're going to kind of notice this as we go through this list, a lot of the games from my list you're going to find a similar situation with, because they haven't come out on any other consoles, unfortunately. And that's kind of like the bummer with a lot of PlayStation 1 games. But it's also one of the reasons why it's important also to do a list like this to know kind of which, PlayStation 1 games you're usually looking at, but also that's one of the reasons why I collect PlayStation 1 games and why it's a collection I think I will have around for a long time. Because even though we're going to get some of these on PlayStation Plus for PlayStation 5, I think there's going to be a lot of stuff like Fear Effect that kind of gets left behind. Although since now Embracer Group kind of owns the IP, maybe we do see more stuff come up from it. I know that they love to do remasters and remakes and kind of re-releasing old games. So hopefully Embracer Group re-releases the Fear Effect games. I think that would be pretty cool. I know it's a franchise that a lot of people actually like, or at least it's got a nice cult fan base to it. But I definitely think it's a game worth checking out. So check out Fear Effect. I think it's awesome. But what do you think about Fear Effect? Let me know in the comments below. You can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter at Carpool Gaming, on youtube.com/carpoolgaming, and on podcast services around the globe. So This has been episode 2 of Greatness Begins. I'm Ryan Turford, and I'm out.